Katalla Coastal Camp, Alaska Territory, October 1908. The autumn wind blowing off the Gulf of Alaska carried a heavy, freezing sea fog that coated the mud streets and rough-sawn timber cabins in a permanent layer of rime ice. It was a landscape that demanded shelter, yet aggressively dismantled any shelter placed upon it. In the center of the valley, men built square wooden boxes, burning massive cords of spruce to fight the encroaching cold. But 70 yards from the edge of the settlement, 30 feet up a sheer south-facing sandstone cliff, Fróði Nolsøe was doing something the valley residents considered entirely mad. Suspended on a heavy hemp rope, his boots braced against the vertical rock, the immigrant was methodically chiseling a 30-foot stone staircase directly into the cliff face. Above him, tucked into a naturally occurring shelf in the bedrock, he was stacking heavy blocks of dark basalt to close off the opening. From the muddy road below, a group of local men stood watching the agonizingly slow progress. Silas Vance, a prospector who had spent 3 winters in the territory, shook his head, pulling his wool collar tighter against the damp chill. Elias Thorne, a timber mill operator, pointed a thick, calloused finger at the dark opening in the rock. "The man is building a tomb," Thorne said. "He's digging a grave in the sky. The first time that Gulf wind shifts, it's going to blow right into that cave and freeze his family solid against the rock." Nathaniel Bradstreet, the Alaska Territorial land agent assigned to the district, stood beside them, holding a leather-bound ledger. He looked at the cliff face with a mixture of bureaucratic frustration and genuine concern. "It is not just foolish," Bradstreet said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "It is a blatant violation of the Homestead statutes. You cannot claim an unpatented vertical rock face as a dwelling. It defies the grid. It defies common sense." The men laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that was swallowed by the coastal wind. They watched the small figure of the immigrant carefully setting another basalt block into place, entirely ignoring the valley below. They thought he was a fool who did not understand the brutality of an Alaskan winter. They believed his family would be forced down from the cliff before December, begging for space by a cast-iron stove in a proper wooden house. What did this Faroese cliff mason understand about the thermal mass of a geological envelope that the established territorial land agents and veteran prospectors had missed? Before we examine the precise thermodynamic principles that allowed a family to thrive inside a frozen cliff face, I want to invite you to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment below. In exchange for your time, I promise you will learn exactly how early pioneers manipulated the immense thermal inertia of the Earth itself to survive conditions that shattered conventional architecture. Tell me in the comments if you have ever experienced the deep, radiant warmth of a stone structure in the dead of winter. Fróði Nolsøe was not a timber framer. He was not a homesteader who viewed the landscape as a flat grid of arable acres to be cleared, leveled, and built upon with milled lumber. He was a Faroese cliff mason, born to the sheer, wind-battered precipices of Vestmanna in the Faroe Islands. In his former life, his hands had not shaped pine planks or driven iron nails into wooden joists. His hands had worked entirely with the raw geology of the North Atlantic, with heavy basalt blocks, sea-scoured ledges, nesting shelf crevices, and the deep, silent stone of the towering bird cliffs. He came from a culture where timber was virtually non-existent, a place where survival meant integrating human shelter directly into the immovable mass of the earth. He understood that a building was not a fragile wooden box placed defiantly on top of the ground, but a hollowed-out pocket within the landscape itself. When Fróði arrived in Katalla with his wife, Runa, and their 2 young sons, Högni and Jogvan, they initially attempted to live as the Americans lived. During their first winter in the territory, they rented a hastily constructed board and batten shack in the center of the valley. The suffering of that first season was absolute and mechanical. The cold did not merely chill, it actively destroyed the materials of their daily existence. In January, their neighbor Silas Vance's heavy iron windlass cracked straight through the drum on the first crank of the morning, the metal made brittle by the extreme negative temperatures. Inside the Nolsøe shack, the kerosene in the parlor lamp turned to a thick, cloudy jelly, refusing to wick or burn. Young Honey's heavy wool coat, hung on a peg in the uninsulated shed, froze so rigidly from the ambient moisture that it cracked at the shoulder seam when Fróði attempted to lift it. The family survived, but Fróði recognized that fighting the cold with thin wooden walls and a roaring fire was a losing battle of attrition. The conventional architecture of the Alaskan coastal frontier was fundamentally flawed for the specific weather patterns of the region. A standard timber cabin in Katalla was built as an independent structure, exposing 4 exterior walls and a roof to the elements. This created roughly 600 square feet of surface area, directly subjected to the offshore winds. When the temperature plummeted, the thermal dynamics were catastrophic. Wood has a relatively low thermal mass, meaning it cannot store heat effectively. The interior warmth generated by a cast iron stove moved rapidly through the timber planks via conduction. Simultaneously, the 30-mile-per-hour winds sweeping off the Gulf accelerated convective heat loss, actively pulling thermal energy away from the exterior siding faster than the stove could replace it inside. Furthermore, the joints between the milled logs or planks expanded and contracted with the wild temperature swings, creating hundreds of linear feet of microscopic gaps. Through these gaps, infiltration occurred. Freezing air forced its way in, while warm air was sucked out by the pressure differentials created by the wind. A standard cabin was not a shelter. It was a sieve that required 60 to 80 cords of wood per winter, merely to maintain a survivable interior temperature, while the corners of the rooms remained coated in frost. Fróði recognized that the solution was not thicker wood or a larger stove. The solution was the elimination of exterior surface area. In late September, he began his work on the sandstone cliff overlooking the valley. The site he chose was a natural geological anomaly, a deep, recessed shelf, 12 feet deep and 16 feet wide, located 30 feet above the valley floor. The opening faced due south, catching the low winter sun, while the solid mass of the cliff protected it entirely from the brutal northern and eastern winds. The construction process was entirely foreign to the timber-focused locals. Fróði spent 3 weeks suspended on ropes, using heavy iron chisels and mallets to cut a 30-foot staircase directly into the sandstone face, creating a narrow, switchbacking path to the shelf. Once the access was secured, he did not build a wooden frame. Instead, he hired a local skiff to haul 2 tons of dense basalt blocks from a rocky outcropping down the coast. Using a block and tackle anchored to the rock above, he hoisted the basalt up to the shelf. He then built a single, massive front wall across the opening of the cave, leaving space for a thick wooden door and a single pane of double-layered glass. The basalt blocks were laid dry, using the traditional Faroese huddled technique, relying on gravity, precise geometry, and a packing of dried coastal moss and clay to seal the joints. The structure required no roof, no northern wall, no eastern wall, and no western wall. The cliff itself provided all of these boundaries. The interior dimensions were modest, a 12 by 16-foot room, but the structural integrity was absolute. It was during the final stages of the basalt wall construction that Nathaniel Bradstreet made his official visit. The Territorial land agent climbed the rough-hewn stone stairs, his boots slipping on the damp rock, clutching a formal citation in his gloved hand. He found Fróði methodically packing clay into a joint around the heavy timber doorframe. "Mr. Nolsøe," Bradstreet said, breathless from the climb, "I am here in my official capacity representing the Territorial Land Office. What you are doing here is entirely outside the bounds of the law." Fróði paused, resting his trowel against the basalt, and looked at the agent. Bradstreet opened his ledger. Under the Territorial Homestead Statute of 1898, a dwelling must be constructed on a platted, unpatented tract of arable land. A vertical rock face is not recognized as a homesteadable parcel. Furthermore, this structure is a hazard. You have no structural supports, you have no proper ventilation, you are occupying federal geology without a patent. I am citing you today. You must vacate this cliff by April 1st or face forced removal. Fróði listened quietly. He looked at the thick paper citation Bradstreet held out. He did not argue about the legal definitions of arable land, nor did he attempt to explain the structural superiority of a dry-stacked basalt wall. He simply reached out, took the paper, folded it, and placed it in his pocket. "The rock is warmer," Fróði said quietly. He picked up his trowel and returned to packing the clay. Bradstreet shook his head, thoroughly exasperated by the immigrant's stubbornness. "You will freeze to death in this stone trap," he said, turning back toward the stairs. "The law is trying to save your family's lives. When the first storm hits, this rock will become a block of ice." Bradstreet's criticism was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of thermal mass and geology. The land agent believed that rock was inherently cold because the surface of a rock in winter feels cold to the touch. But Fróði was not relying on the surface of the rock. He was relying on the deep, internal temperature of the earth itself. The physics behind the Faroese cliff mason's design centered on a principle known as a cliff mass thermal envelope. The sandstone shelf Fróði had chosen was not a thin wall. It was a continuous geological formation extending hundreds of feet into the mountain. Sandstone has a density of approximately 135 pounds per cubic foot. This immense density gives it a massive specific heat capacity, the ability to absorb, store, and slowly release thermal energy. Deep underground beyond the frost line, the Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature of roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the weather on the surface. By burying 3 walls and the roof of his cabin directly into the sandstone, Fróði was tapping into this massive 55-degree rock reservoir. The cliff acted as an infinite thermal battery. In a conventional timber cabin, the interior heat is constantly fighting the negative temperatures outside across all 6 sides of the structure. In Fróði's cliff cabin, 3 walls and the ceiling were never exposed to the outside air. They were permanently pressed against the 55-degree bedrock. Therefore, the heat loss through those surfaces was virtually zero. The only surface exposed to the harsh Alaskan winter was the single south-facing basalt wall, which measured roughly 120 square feet. This drastic reduction in exposed surface area changed the thermodynamic mathematics entirely. At negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, a standard timber cabin in the valley, with 600 square feet of exposure and high infiltration rates, would lose approximately 15,000 BTUs of heat per hour. It required a massive, continuous fire just to keep the interior above freezing. Fróði's cliff cabin, with only 120 square feet of exposure, backed by the insulating mass of the mountain, experienced a heat loss of only about 3,500 BTUs per hour. The small cast-iron potbelly stove Fróði installed did not have to heat the room from negative 20. It only had to raise the ambient temperature from the rock's natural 55 degrees up to a comfortable 70 degrees. Once the interior air warmed the surface of the interior sandstone walls, the rock itself began to radiate that heat back into the room. It was not a shelter fighting the environment. It was a shelter cooperating with the geology. The ultimate test of this thermodynamic cooperation arrived in the second week of January, when an atmospheric anomaly known as an Alaska Gulf polar surge descended upon the Katalla coast. A massive high-pressure system of Arctic air stalled over the region, pulling moisture off the Gulf and instantly freezing it. The resulting storm was not a brief blizzard, but a grinding 9-day siege of sustained negative 22-degree temperatures, driven by relentless 30-mile-per-hour offshore winds. The sea fog rolled into the valley, instantly freezing upon contact with any surface, coating the town in a heavy, blinding rime ice. The conditions were apocalyptic for the conventional structures in the valley below. The biting wind found every microscopic gap in the timber cabins. Families huddled in the center of their rooms, feeding their cast-iron stoves until the metal glowed a dull, dangerous red. Yet the perimeter of their homes remained deep in the negative temperatures. Condensation from their breath froze instantly on the interior walls, building up thick layers of white frost inside their parlors. By the 5th day of the storm, the suffering in the valley was severe. Silas Vance exhausted his wood supply and was forced to burn his own furniture to keep his stove active. Elias Thorne's roof, battered by the wind, developed a severe draft that dropped his interior temperature to 14 degrees, forcing his family to sleep in their heavy winter coats, shivering uncontrollably. High on the cliff face, entirely obscured by the freezing fog, the Nolsøe family experienced a drastically different reality. The 30-mile-per-hour winds howled harmlessly past the solid mass of the mountain. The heavy basalt front wall, sealed tight with clay, allowed zero infiltration. Inside the 12 by 16-foot carved shelf, the environment was not merely survivable, it was deeply, profoundly tranquil. The contrast between the two realities was stark and measurable. Down in the valley, Thomas Arris, a neighboring homesteader, placed a pot of water on the unheated edge of his iron stove. The water froze solid before the glowing coals in the center of the firebox had even cooled. Inside the cliff cabin, the ambient temperature held steady at a comfortable 70 degrees, fueled by nothing more than a few small pieces of driftwood fed into the potbelly stove every 4 hours. The normalcy of their existence inside the rock was the ultimate proof of the innovation. Fróði Nolsøe did not wear a coat. She sat in a wooden chair near the glass pane, bathed in the radiant heat of the sandstone, calmly knitting a wool sweater with bare hands. On the deep stone ledge near the stove, a wooden bowl of yeast dough sat rising perfectly, the gentle, even warmth of the rock providing the exact environment required for the bread to proof. The cliff had entirely neutralized the fury of the Gulf. On the 8th day of the polar surge, Nathaniel Bradstreet strapped on his long snowshoes and set out on the coast circuit. As the Territorial agent, it was his duty to check on the outer claims, fully expecting to find frozen casualties. The cold was a physical weight pressing against his chest. The wind tore at his heavy parka, and the freezing fog coated his eyelashes in ice. Halfway through his trek, the kerosene hand lamp he carried sputtered and died, the metal wick housing frozen completely shut by the ambient moisture. His route took him past the base of the sandstone cliff. Through the swirling whiteout conditions, he looked up, expecting to see the Nolsøe family's tomb. He remembered his own words, that the rock would become a block of ice. Driven by a grim sense of duty, Bradstreet unstrapped his snowshoes and began the treacherous climb up the 30-foot stone stair. The wind whipped violently at his back, threatening to tear him from the cliff face. His hands, clad in thick leather mittens, were entirely numb by the time he reached the narrow shelf. He found the heavy timber door coated in a thick layer of rime ice. Bracing his shoulder against the wood, expecting to find the rigid, frozen remains of the Faroese family inside, Bradstreet shoved the door open and stepped across the threshold. The sensory transition was so violent it caused him to stumble backward. Bradstreet expected the sharp, biting edge of stagnant frost, the smell of damp decay, and the chilling silence of a failed shelter. Instead, he was hit by a physical wall of dry, radiant 70-degree heat. The air inside the rock was still, smelling faintly of wood smoke, baked bread, and cured meat. He stood in the entryway, snow falling from his parka, his face draining of color as the feeling rushed painfully back into his numb cheeks. He blinked, trying to process the scene before him. In the center of the room, young Høgni sat at a small wooden table, wearing only a thin cotton shirt sleeve, quietly reading a book by the light of a perfectly burning oil lamp. The walls of the cave were completely dry, radiating a gentle, enveloping warmth. But it was the detail on the far wall that broke Bradstreet's certainty entirely. Hanging from a wooden peg driven into the sandstone was a large crock of skirpikjut, traditional Faroese wind-cured mutton. In the freezing, moisture-laden environment of a conventional cabin, the meat would have frozen solid or succumbed to damp rot. Here in the stable, dry heat of the thermal envelope, the meat remained firm red and perfectly preserved, curing precisely as it would have in the mild, stable climate of the Faroe Islands through Gregorius Messa. Fróði stood up from his chair near the stove. He did not gloat. He did not mention the citation folded in his pocket. He simply walked over, took the frozen hand lamp from Bradstreet's shaking fingers, and set it near the stove to thaw. Bradstreet slowly pulled off his leather mitten. He reached out with his bare hand and placed his palm flat against the back wall of the cabin, the solid sandstone of the cliff face. The rock was not cold. It was warm to the touch, vibrating with the stored thermal energy of the earth itself. "You didn't build a timber shelter," Bradstreet whispered, staring at his hand against the stone. "You built a geological tide pool." The Territorial agent stayed in the cliff cabin for 3 hours, drinking hot tea and writing furiously in his leather ledger. He did not issue a secondary citation. Instead, he recorded the exact dimensions of the shelf, the thickness of the basalt blocks, and the precise temperature differential between the interior rock and the exterior storm. When he finally descended the stairs and returned to the valley, he carried with him the proof of a superior methodology. The vindication of Fróði Nolsøe did not remain an isolated incident. The sheer undeniable reality of his family's comfort during one of the most brutal storms in territorial history shifted the architectural paradigm of the coastal settlements. By the spring of 1909, the narrative of the warm cliff cabin had spread beyond Katalla. In April of that year, the Tingakrosur, a prominent Faroese American newspaper published in Seattle, printed Fróði's exact cliff cabin plans, detailing the 80 huddled masonry techniques and the mathematical principles of the cliff mass envelope. The publication reached the scattered communities of Nordic immigrants working the Alaskan coast. The adoption was rapid and highly specific. By the autumn of 1909, 4 different Faroese fisher families across the Katalla and Cordova districts had abandoned their valley timber claims. They sought out south-facing rock shelves, cutting stone stairs, and hauling basalt blocks to build their own thermal envelopes. The measurable results were staggering. These families reported a 90% reduction in their winter fuel consumption. While the valley residents continued to burn 70 cords of wood a year, the cliff dwellers maintained 70-degree interiors on less than 6 cords of scavenged driftwood. They had effectively opted out of the brutal winter economy. The principles Fróði Nolsøe utilized in 1908 were not primitive. They were incredibly advanced, predating modern architectural science by nearly a century. Today, modern engineers and architects recognize these exact concepts in the fields of earth-sheltered home design and passive annual heat storage, or PAHS. Modern builders spend tens of thousands of dollars pouring massive concrete retaining walls and burying structures under tons of engineered soil to achieve the exact same thermal mass and surface area reduction that Fróði achieved with a chisel and a natural sandstone shelf. The modern science of passive solar heating and thermal flywheels is simply a heavily calculated version of the Faroese cliff masons' intuitive understanding of the Earth's capacity to store energy. The legacy of the Katalla cliff cabin offers a profound lesson about our relationship with the environment. Fróði Nolsøe succeeded because he refused to view the landscape as an adversary to be conquered with thin walls and massive fires. When the established authorities demanded he build a fragile box on a flat grid, he looked at the sheer vertical face of the mountain and saw not an obstacle, but an ally. He didn't build a cabin against a coastal storm. He asked a cliff to be 3 walls and lit a small fire against the 4th. If you found value in this historical engineering narrative, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel, leave a like on this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other historical building methods do you think modern architecture has forgotten? Let me know. Please note that this video presents historically inspired reconstructions and narratives for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and events are fictionalized representations of historical dynamics. The techniques, thermodynamics, and physical principles discussed are based on real historical practices. Any modern application of earth-sheltered or thermal mass construction should strictly follow current building standards, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.